are you people? This is a private family funeral.
I'm here because Richard Harrison was my husband too.
That's impossible. Our father had only one family.
No, he had two.
Richard Harrison was the kind of man whose name carried weight in every corner of American business. He built a hospitality empire from nothing, turning small, struggling hotels into luxury destinations that stretched across multiple states. At the time of his death, his net worth was estimated at nearly $2 billion. But money was never the part of the story that shocked people. What shocked them was what happened on the day of his funeral, when the rain fell quietly over a private cemetery filled with black umbrellas and silent guests who had come to say goodbye to a man they believed they understood. His coffin was being lowered into the ground, and his 3 children stood close together, dressed in expensive black clothing, already speaking in low voices about estates, shares, and control of assets. To them, this was not just a funeral, it was the beginning of inheritance. But before the flowers on his grave could even settle, a black SUV stopped at the entrance, and everything changed. A woman stepped out first, calm and composed, followed by a young attorney carrying a sealed folder and a young doctor holding a small leather case. They walked forward without hesitation, as if they had been expected. Nobody recognized them, yet they did not look lost or out of place. They looked like people arriving to claim something long overdue. Then the woman stopped a few feet from the grieving family, looked directly at Richard Harrison's children, and said 5 words that froze every conversation around her. Richard Harrison was my husband too. For a moment, no one moved. Even the rain seemed to fall quieter, as if the world itself was trying to understand what had just been said. The children stared at her, waiting for someone to explain it away, to call it a mistake, to dismiss it as confusion. But the woman did not blink. She did not step back. She simply stood there with the weight of a truth that no one in that cemetery was prepared for. Because in that single moment, the life Richard Harrison had carefully separated for decades was no longer hidden, and the foundation of everything his first family believed they owned began to crack. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And what happened next would expose a truth nobody saw coming. For 25 years, Richard Harrison built 2 lives that never touched each other in public. On one side, he was the billionaire businessman known across America, a man whose hotels defined luxury and whose influence reached boardrooms and political circles. On the other side, hidden away from headlines and social circles, was a second life that only a handful of people ever saw in fragments. Even his closest legal advisors never had the full picture. They only handled isolated instructions, separate accounts, private transfers, and carefully worded documents that never explained the full story. And because Richard Harrison was precise, careful, and always one step ahead in business, no one questioned how deeply his personal life was divided. But now, standing in the middle of his funeral, that separation had collapsed completely. The woman who identified herself as his second wife did not come alone. She brought a young attorney carrying a sealed legal folder and a young doctor holding records that no one understood yet. And what made the situation more unsettling was not just their presence, but their confidence. They were not asking for permission to speak. They were there because they believed they already had a place in the story Richard Harrison left behind. The first family stood frozen, trying to process what they were hearing, because everything they knew about their father suggested control, discipline, and precision. A man like Richard Harrison did not simply build a second life without leaving a trace. And yet here was the trace, standing in front of them in real time, refusing to disappear. Whispers began spreading through the crowd as people tried to make sense of the claim. Did Richard Harrison live a double life? Who exactly were these people who arrived only after his death? Why did they appear now, at the exact moment his estate was about to be divided? And most importantly, why did every mention of his final will seem to point toward them in ways no one expected? The attorney stepped forward and calmly stated that they were not there for confrontation, but for recognition. He said Richard Harrison had left behind legally binding documents that had never been shared with the first family, documents that would now be opened in full view of everyone present. That single statement changed everything in the atmosphere of the funeral, because it meant this was no misunderstanding, no mistaken identity, and no coincidence. It was planned. For 25 years, Richard Harrison kept a secret so carefully protected that even his lawyers only knew fragments of it. But now, that secret was no longer hidden. It was standing in front of his coffin, waiting for the moment the truth would be read aloud. And in that moment, it became clear that the story of Richard Harrison was not just about wealth or legacy, but about two families who never knew they were connected until everything was already too late. Richard Harrison was the definition of success in modern America. His rise was the kind of story that business schools studied and financial magazines celebrated. Born into poverty in a small industrial town, he grew up understanding struggle before he ever understood opportunity. As a teenager, he worked long hours in warehouses and construction sites, often sleeping only a few hours before returning to work again. He was known for being quiet, observant, and relentlessly focused. While others talked about escaping poverty, Richard Harrison was already planning how to build something that would outlast him. In his early 20s, he entered the hospitality industry through a small motel purchase that most investors ignored. It was old, poorly managed, and located in an area others considered unprofitable. But Richard saw something different. He renovated it himself, negotiated directly with suppliers, and reinvested every early profit back into expansion. Within a few years, that single motel became a chain of properties. Then it became a regional network. Then it became a national brand that reshaped luxury travel standards across the United States. By the time he reached 68 years old, Richard Harrison's name was attached to hotels in major cities, private aviation services, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios worth nearly $2 billion. American media called him a self-made genius. Investors called him disciplined. Employees called him demanding but fair. But behind closed doors, Richard Harrison was something else entirely. A man who believed control was the only way to protect everything he had built. Yet even with all his success, something in his personal life never aligned with the empire he created. Inside his mansion, where silence replaced warmth, his first family lived surrounded by wealth, but disconnected from meaning. His children had grown up in privilege without pressure, surrounded by comfort without responsibility. Richard Harrison had given them access to everything money could buy, but not the structure that had built his own life. And over time, that gap became impossible to ignore. Jason Harrison, his eldest son, drifted into gambling and substance abuse, chasing temporary escapes while burning through money faster than it could be controlled. Olivia Harrison, his daughter, built a public image around luxury and influence, but her life revolved around appearance rather than purpose. Daniel Harrison, the youngest, moved from one business idea to another, each failing under the weight of inexperience and entitlement. Richard watched it unfold quietly, intervening less with each passing year, as if unsure whether he had the right to correct what he had indirectly created. To the outside world, the Harrison family represented wealth and achievement. But inside the walls of their estate, there was distance, frustration, and a growing sense that inheritance alone would not hold anything together once Richard Harrison was gone. And as his empire continued to expand, so did the silence within his own home, until eventually, Richard Harrison began building parts of his life away from it entirely, in ways no one in his first family ever imagined. The first family of Richard Harrison lived in a world where consequences rarely existed. Jason Harrison, at 32, had become the most concerning reflection of that environment. What began as casual betting during college turned into a full gambling dependency that followed him into adulthood. He moved between high-stakes casinos and private online platforms, losing millions that were quietly covered by accounts tied to his father's name. Alongside that, he developed a dependency on substances that kept him detached from reality, creating a cycle Richard Harrison could no longer easily interrupt without causing public damage to the family name. Olivia Harrison, at 29, built her identity in a different direction but with the same outcome. She became a luxury influencer whose life revolved around visibility rather than substance. Every purchase, every trip, every appearance was documented for an audience that admired her lifestyle but never saw its instability. She spent without hesitation, often ordering items that cost more than most Americans earned in a year, treating wealth as a constant backdrop rather than a finite resource. To her, money was not something to manage. It was something that would always return. Daniel Harrison, the youngest at 26, lived in a cycle of constant movement. Nightclubs, private events, and failed business ventures defined his routine. He entered industries he barely understood, relying on his last name to open doors that experience never could. But those doors closed just as quickly as they opened, leaving behind debt, frustration, and a growing pattern of instability that Richard Harrison observed with increasing concern. Richard gave them everything they asked for: the best schools in the country, luxury homes in multiple states, unlimited credit cards that removed any need to ask permission, private security, travel access, and connections that most people would never reach in a lifetime. On paper, they had every advantage possible. But over time, something fundamental changed in how they viewed that advantage. They stopped seeing money as something earned through effort or responsibility. Instead, it became something automatic, something permanent, something they believed could never disappear. And that belief shaped every decision they made, slowly distancing them from the very discipline that built the Harrison empire in the first place. Richard Harrison rarely reacted publicly to their behavior. He preferred silence over confrontation, observation over correction. But there were moments, especially late at night when the estate was quiet, where he would sit alone and look at the lives his children were living. And in those moments, a realization began to settle, and that became harder to ignore with each passing year. Because every time Richard Harrison looked at Jason Harrison, Olivia Harrison, and Daniel Harrison, he did not always see his children anymore. He saw strangers living inside a legacy they were slowly taking for granted. 25 years earlier, Richard Harrison was not yet the untouchable billionaire the world would come to know. He was still building, still proving himself, still carrying the weight of every decision on his shoulders with a level of intensity that left little room for personal connection. At that stage in his life, every relationship he formed seemed filtered through ambition, and every conversation eventually circled back to business, expansion, and control. It was during one of those early business conferences, held in Chicago, that he met Grace Carter for the first time. Grace Carter was not part of his industry. She was not an investor, not a shareholder, and not someone impressed by titles or projections of wealth. She worked in nonprofit development and community education programs, often dealing with families affected by poverty and instability. She entered rooms with a different kind of confidence, one that did not depend on status or approval. And when she first crossed paths with Richard Harrison, she did not treat him like a man destined for greatness. She treated him like someone whose ideas deserved to be questioned. Their first interactions were simple but unusual. Richard would speak about growth strategies and financial scaling, and Grace Carter would challenge the human cost behind those decisions. Where others agreed with him, she asked uncomfortable questions. Where others saw success, she pointed out consequences he had not considered. At first, Richard Harrison resisted her perspective. He was not used to being questioned, especially not by someone outside his world. But something about her consistency made it impossible for him to ignore her completely. Over time, those professional disagreements turned into longer conversations after events ended. Richard found himself listening more than speaking when Grace Carter was around. She did not admire his wealth, and she did not try to benefit from it. Instead, she engaged with him as a person, not as a brand. That was unfamiliar to him, and in some ways, it made her presence even more difficult to dismiss. There were moments when she would challenge him directly, telling him that building wealth without building people would eventually leave everything unstable. Richard would respond with logic, data, and experience, but Grace Carter would respond with something he had not built his empire on: perspective rooted in lived experience. And slowly, without either of them acknowledging it openly, their conversations became something neither of them could easily walk away from. Richard Harrison began to change in subtle ways. He stayed longer after meetings. He asked more questions that were not related to business. He found himself laughing in moments that had nothing to do with strategy or negotiation. And Grace Carter, despite her independence, began to see something in him that was not visible to the public: a man carrying responsibility alone for too long without realizing its cost. What started as disagreement gradually turned into familiarity, and familiarity turned into trust. And in time, trust became something deeper neither of them had planned for. Richard Harrison, a man who built his life on control and calculation, found himself drawn to someone who refused to be controlled or calculated. And what neither of them fully understood at that moment was that this connection would not remain separate from the rest of his life. Because the decisions Richard Harrison would soon make would not only shape his future with Grace Carter, but would eventually create a second family that no one in his first world would ever be prepared to accept. Richard Harrison made a decision that would quietly divide his life into two separate worlds, a decision that even his closest advisors would never fully understand. After his connection with Grace Carter deepened over time, he eventually married her in a private ceremony with no media coverage, no public announcement, and no entry into the social circles that defined his public identity. To the outside world, Richard Harrison remained exactly who he had always been, a billionaire focused on expansion, acquisitions, and legacy. But behind that carefully maintained image, a completely different life had begun. Instead of bringing Grace Carter into his mansion or merging her life with his public empire, Richard Harrison made another choice. He purchased a modest home in a quiet state far from the attention of financial hubs and media presence. It was not extravagant, not designed to impress, and not associated with the wealth he controlled elsewhere. It was simple, private, and intentionally separate from everything tied to his public identity. And in that home, a second family began to grow. Ethan Carter was the first child in that life. From a young age, he showed exceptional intelligence, discipline, and focus. Richard Harrison did not raise him with unlimited access to wealth or luxury. Instead, he ensured Ethan Carter had access to education, structure, and opportunity, but not dependence. Ethan studied with intensity, often working multiple academic programs at once, eventually earning his way into law school and later becoming an attorney through merit and effort rather than privilege. Sophia Carter, his younger sister, followed a similar path, but in a different direction. She was deeply compassionate, drawn to medicine and service. She pursued her education with consistency and determination, eventually becoming a doctor. Like her brother, she was supported in education but never allowed to rely on inherited wealth or unchecked privilege. Every achievement she earned came through work, discipline, and persistence. Richard Harrison maintained a strict rule in this second household, a rule that shaped every decision made there. He made it clear to Ethan Carter and Sophia Carter that they would never depend on his money as a foundation for their lives. He provided structure, education, and opportunity, but not comfort without effort. In that environment, they learned responsibility early, understanding that success was something built rather than received. The contrast between the two families Richard Harrison created became more evident over time. While his first children lived in excess without structure, his second children were shaped by expectation, discipline, and accountability. Ethan Carter and Sophia Carter worked for every milestone they reached, studied through challenges, and built careers that reflected their own abilities rather than their father's fortune. And yet, through all of this separation, Richard Harrison never fully disappeared from their lives. For 25 years, he maintained a presence that no one in his public world ever knew existed. He would visit them quietly, without security details or public attention, moving between two identities that never crossed paths in the public eye. In one life, he was the billionaire shaping industries. In the other, he was a husband and father observing the results of discipline and structure he wished he had once instilled elsewhere. And for 25 years, no one suspected a thing. Everything in the world of Richard Harrison changed in a single moment that no one could have fully prepared for. It happened quietly at first, without warning, without spectacle, without the kind of build-up people usually expect when a life this large comes to an end. Richard Harrison suffered a sudden heart attack while alone in one of his private residences. There were no public appearances leading up to it, no dramatic signs, just a collapse of a man whose life had been divided for decades between pressure, secrecy, and control. By the time news of his death reached the public, it spread rapidly through financial networks, media outlets, and business circles across America. Headlines began appearing within minutes, each one confirming what many thought would never happen so suddenly. The billionaire who built one of the most recognizable hotel empires in the country was gone. And just like that, attention shifted from his legacy to what he left behind. Inside the Harrison family estate, the reaction was immediate, but not in the way most people would expect from grieving children. Jason Harrison, Olivia Harrison, and Daniel Harrison were not focused on memories or loss. Their conversations turned quickly toward what came next. The weight of grief was overshadowed by the reality of inheritance, control, and ownership. The silence of their father's absence was replaced almost instantly by questions of division. Who would take control of the mansion? Who would inherit the hotel chain? Who would gain access to the private jets, the investment portfolios, and the offshore accounts that represented decades of work? These were not discussions delayed for respect or mourning. They were discussions happening before the funeral arrangements had even been finalized. And in those conversations, one thing became painfully clear. Richard Harrison's children were already treating his death as a transition of assets rather than a personal loss. But while the first family began positioning themselves for what they believed was guaranteed, there was something none of them were aware of. Something Richard Harrison had already set in motion long before his final moments. A decision had already been made, written, documented, and secured in legal frameworks that no one in his first household had ever been allowed to see. Because Richard Harrison did not leave his legacy to chance, and he did not leave it to assumption. Long before his death, he had already determined who would carry his empire forward, and who would be left questioning everything they thought they were entitled to. The rain had not stopped when the cemetery grew heavier with tension than weather. The sky remained dull, the ground already darkened from water and footsteps, and the atmosphere around Richard Harrison's funeral had shifted from mourning into something far more unstable. That was when Grace Carter stepped forward again, no longer as a distant figure, but as someone prepared to confront a truth that had been buried for 25 years. Behind her, Ethan Carter and Sophia Carter followed closely, carrying themselves with a calm that stood in stark contrast to the growing hostility in front of them. Jason Harrison noticed them first, and his reaction was immediate. His grief had already been replaced with frustration and entitlement, and seeing strangers approach what he believed was his family's moment pushed him over the edge. He stepped forward, his voice sharp and uncontrolled, demanding that they be removed. "Get these people out of here," he shouted, pointing toward Grace Carter and her children as if their presence alone was an insult to everything he believed was his. Within moments, security personnel began to move in, uncertain but prepared to act based on the chaos unfolding in front of the mourners. But before anyone could physically remove them, Ethan Carter stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He simply spoke with clarity that cut through the noise around him. He stated his name clearly, identifying himself as Attorney Ethan Carter, and then delivered a sentence that changed the direction of everything happening at the funeral. He said that Richard Harrison was his father. For a brief moment, everything went silent. The reaction that followed was immediate but divided. Olivia Harrison let out a short laugh, as if the statement itself was too absurd to take seriously. Daniel Harrison shook his head, openly dismissing the claim, calling them frauds and accusing them of trying to exploit their father's death. The first family surrounded themselves with disbelief, refusing to accept what they were hearing, clinging to the version of reality they had always known. Then Grace Carter stepped forward again. This time, she did not argue. She did not explain. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed document, carefully preserved and untouched. When she held it up, the tension shifted again, because it was not just a claim anymore. It was a record, a marriage certificate connecting her directly to Richard Harrison, legally binding and dated years before anyone in the first family had ever suspected another life existed. The reaction was immediate. Voices rose. Questions overlapped. Security hesitated. The funeral itself began to lose structure as shock replaced order. Jason Harrison stood frozen. Olivia Harrison stopped laughing, and Daniel Harrison looked between the document and Grace Carter as if trying to force reality to align with what he thought was impossible. But even as that moment unraveled in full view of everyone present, there was something far more significant that no one had seen yet. Because as shocking as the marriage certificate was, it was not the final piece of Richard Harrison's plan. Inside a sealed envelope, still untouched, still waiting to be opened, was the part of the story that would determine not just who he was in life, but who would control everything he left behind. The atmosphere inside the luxury law office was nothing like the chaos of the cemetery, but the tension carried the same weight. The room was designed to project control and wealth, polished wood, soft lighting, and glass walls that overlooked the city Richard Harrison once dominated. But now, none of that mattered. Jason Harrison, Olivia Harrison, and Daniel Harrison sat on one side of the table, still carrying disbelief from what they had witnessed earlier. Across from them sat Grace Carter, Ethan Carter, and Sophia Carter, calm but fully aware that everything they knew was about to be tested in ways they could not predict. At the center of the room stood the attorney, holding the sealed envelope that had been carried from the cemetery. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the smallest sound seemed amplified. Then slowly, deliberately, the attorney broke the seal. Inside was a final instruction from Richard Harrison, one that required a specific sequence to be followed exactly as written. The lights dimmed slightly as a screen lowered from the ceiling, and within seconds, the room shifted from a legal setting into something far more personal. A video began to play. The image of Richard Harrison appeared, older but composed, sitting in a familiar office space. His presence immediately silenced every reaction in the room. He looked directly into the camera, as if he was speaking not just to those present, but to a moment he had already seen coming long before his death. "If you are watching this, I am gone." The words settled heavily, and for the first time, even Jason Harrison leaned forward without speaking. Olivia Harrison's expression softened slightly, while Daniel Harrison looked away for a moment before returning his gaze to the screen. The reality of hearing their father speak after his death created a stillness that no argument or accusation had produced. Richard Harrison continued, his tone steady but firm. He looked directly toward where his first children were seated, as if he could see them through time itself. He spoke about opportunity, about the life he had provided, and about choices that had been made long before this moment arrived. "I gave you opportunities," he said, "but you wasted them." The words were not shouted. They were not emotional. They were final in a way that carried more weight than anger ever could. The discomfort in the room grew immediately. Jason Harrison shifted in his seat. Olivia Harrison lowered her gaze, and Daniel Harrison clenched his jaw as the meaning of those words began to settle in. Then Richard Harrison turned slightly in the video, his focus shifting toward Grace Carter, Ethan Carter, and Sophia Carter. The tone of his voice changed, not in emotion, but in recognition. He spoke about discipline, about structure, about the kind of responsibility that had shaped their lives away from the public world he had built elsewhere. "I gave you discipline," he said. "You built your own success." That single contrast divided the room completely. The first family sat in silence that now felt heavier than accusation, while Grace Carter and her children remained composed, not reacting, but absorbing the weight of what was being revealed. At that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room that this was not a simple distribution of wealth or a traditional will reading. Richard Harrison had prepared something far more intentional. And as the video continued to play, it became obvious that everything said so far was only the beginning of a decision that would reshape every assumption they had about inheritance, loyalty, and legacy. The silence that followed Richard Harrison's video did not last long. It shifted quickly into something far more irreversible, because what came next was no longer emotion or interpretation. It was execution of a legal structure that had been prepared long before anyone in the room had gathered there. The attorney stepped forward again, holding the final documents in his hands. His voice was steady, professional, and detached, the kind of tone that does not leave room for argument or interruption. He began to read the final will of Richard Harrison line by line, each sentence tightening the atmosphere inside the room. Ethan Carter and Sophia Carter were named first in the distribution of the empire. 85% of the company's shares, including controlling interest in the hotel chain and associated investments, were assigned directly to them. The words were simple, but their impact was not. It meant control, leadership, and authority over everything Richard Harrison had built over decades. Then came Grace Carter. She was designated as the primary beneficiary of the family foundation, including oversight of its charitable structures and financial direction. This was not framed as inheritance in the traditional sense, but as stewardship, a continuation of purpose rather than possession. Next came the real estate portfolio, properties across multiple states, luxury assets, and long-held investments. These were also assigned to the secret family, Ethan Carter and Sophia Carter, consolidating the majority of Richard Harrison's tangible legacy under their control. Then the attorney paused before addressing the first family. Jason Harrison, Olivia Harrison, and Daniel Harrison remained seated, but the shift in tone already signaled what was coming. The inheritance they had assumed was automatic, guaranteed, and uncontested was now reduced to something minimal. A small monthly allowance was assigned to them, structured not as a reward, but as a controlled provision. They were also explicitly restricted from any access to company funds, assets, or decision-making power. But Richard Harrison's final instruction was not financial. It was conditional. Before any further access to inheritance or authority could ever be considered, Jason Harrison, Olivia Harrison, and Daniel Harrison were required to complete rehabilitation, finish their formal education, and work continuously for 1 full year under supervision. Only after fulfilling those conditions would any additional review of their standing take place. The meaning of the document settled into the room like something no one could reverse. Jason Harrison reacted first. His composure broke completely as frustration and disbelief turned into open anger. Olivia Harrison covered her face, overwhelmed as tears began to fall, unable to reconcile what she was hearing with the life she believed was already secured. Daniel Harrison pushed his chair back abruptly, stood without speaking, and walked out of the room, refusing to stay and hear any further details. In a matter of minutes, everything they had believed about their future had been dismantled, not by outsiders, not by legal loopholes, but by Richard Harrison himself, who had decided long before his death exactly how his empire would continue, and who would no longer be trusted to carry it without change. 6 months after the reading of Richard Harrison's final will, the shock that once filled the law office had not disappeared, but it had changed form. What was once disbelief had turned into consequence, and what once felt like rejection had become reality that could no longer be avoided. The empire Richard Harrison built was now operating under a structure no one in his first family had ever expected to face. Jason Harrison entered a rehabilitation program quietly, away from the lifestyle and environments that had defined most of his adult life. For the first time in years, he was removed from access to unlimited resources and placed into a setting where structure replaced indulgence. The change was not immediate or easy, but it was enforced by conditions his father had written with precision long before his death. Olivia Harrison, once known for her constant display of luxury and influence, began working within the family foundation under Grace Carter's leadership. Her role was no longer about visibility or status. Instead, she was exposed to the internal operations of the very system. 6 months had not just changed the structure of the Harrison empire. It had changed the people who once believed it belonged to them by default. Jason Harrison, once consumed by excess and escape, had entered rehabilitation under strict supervision. The process was not framed as punishment, but as correction, a forced return to reality after years of living without limits. Olivia Harrison, who once measured life through visibility and luxury, now worked within Grace Carter's foundation, handling programs that supported education and family rebuilding efforts, often confronting realities she had previously never considered. Daniel Harrison, who had walked out of the will reading in anger, eventually returned under pressure of the conditions set in Richard Harrison's final instructions, and began learning the fundamentals of the family business directly under Ethan Carter's guidance. Meanwhile, the side of the family that no one in the public world had ever taken seriously was now stabilizing everything Richard Harrison had built. Ethan Carter and Sophia Carter were not only managing the company, they were actively saving it from financial instability that had begun forming beneath the surface long before Richard Harrison's death. Contracts were renegotiated, failing divisions were restructured, and financial systems were corrected with a level of discipline that came from years of preparation rather than inheritance. Grace Carter oversaw the foundation's expansion, ensuring that the wealth being managed also carried purpose beyond profit. It became clear over time that Richard Harrison had not simply divided his empire based on emotion or secrecy. He had assessed patterns, behavior, and responsibility across both sides of his life. He had seen how his first family responded to abundance without structure, and how his second family responded to structure without abundance. And in that comparison, he made a decision that no one else was prepared to understand at the time of his death. The empire, as it turned out, could only survive under hands that understood discipline before privilege. And the family he had hidden for 25 years was not hidden out of shame or fear, but out of preparation. It was the family he quietly tested, shaped, and trusted with the future he knew could not be left to chance. Richard Harrison did not leave his fortune to the children who simply carried his name. He left it to the children who carried his principles, even when no one was watching. And in the end, the question remained for everyone who heard his story. If you were Richard Harrison, would you have done the same thing? And now the question this entire story leaves behind is not just about Richard Harrison, or even about the empire he built. It is about what people believe they are owed, and what they actually earn when everything is stripped down to responsibility and character. Did Richard Harrison betray his first family? Or did he make the only decision he believed would protect everything he spent his life building? Should children automatically inherit wealth simply because of their name? Or should inheritance be tied to discipline, effort, and accountability? And in the end, who truly deserved the fortune more? The family that expected it, or the family that was prepared for it? There is no simple answer to that question, and maybe that is exactly why this story continues to stay with people long after it ends. If this story shocked you, subscribe, because the next family secret we're uncovering may be even more unbelievable.